Hey, hello. How are you? Come on, let's do it with a little bit more energy. How are you? Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I think this is a very special moment. I think we're living in this specific volcano, in this 2023, one of the most interesting moments that we'll potentially live in our lifetimes. Think about that. I mean, when you think about all the different changes that we've already seen in the last 5, 10, or 20 years, suddenly we are in a very chaotic moment of history where a lot of things are happening in so many different industries, and of course that's what leads us to be here. But I would dare to say that if we were to go forward 5, 10, 15, 20 years, I think we're going to go back to this very specific moment and as one of the foundational moments where things changed. And I know like this sounds very daring and very ambitious to say, so maybe I have to do a couple of steps back to try to really contextualize why I'm saying this. I've been in all the Volcano Summits since 2018, and there's always some magic that is happening, but I think like this year is very unique and very special in just how everything is shaping. But to really understand why I'm so excited about this unique moment in time, I want to first go back some years. Just a little bit before I was born, I think humanity did one of the most transformational things that has ever existed, which was the possibility after creating fire, the wheel, so many other inventions, we suddenly had the capabilities to store a single bit. Just being able to have enough electronics to capture the state of a 0 or a 1 in one of these very beautiful devices. And that was the start of a journey that will transform humanity in ways that we have never done before or can even imagine so far how it's going to look in the future. Because once we had that, we actually put a lot of those into a chip like this. With a lot of these transistors, we were able to actually split these zeros and ones in two pieces. One is the data, and the other one is the code that is taking that data and doing something, first, quite simple with it. And then we started to add more complexity with each one of those instructions. First, we were just adding, subtracting, doing some math here and there. But suddenly, we started to add a couple of very interesting elements, like a monitor, a mouse, a keyboard, and a user interface, and we had the personal computer. And this became a very powerful tool that will allow us to expand our capabilities, literally make our brains be able to go quicker, create quicker, interact with all the different mediums. So, even Steve Jobs called it the bicycle of the mind. Think about that. Just taking something like the mind and making it more capable, giving it a tool that we can just go faster and go places. And I would say that first revolution, the personal computer revolution, went pretty well. We went and created different tools like the word processor, Excel, first called VisiCalc, and it started to allow us to have more data in that computer and just make the output of everything faster. And I would say this first cycle of going from not having computers to suddenly having computers in a lot of different industries went pretty well. We just brought more efficiency. And people started to use them to create and do a lot of very interesting innovations. But it became even more interesting when someone decided to add different interfaces so that these computers could communicate between each other. And we not only connected the computers, but also connected the humans that were using that computer. And that cycle, we'll see, it had a lot of positive, but also some challenges and some negatives. First, we started just with some tools like Craigslist and other simple websites to really explore all the different interactions that we have as humans, right? We started from meeting other people, for making friends and dating, to finding where to live, to organizing vacations together, renting, selling, all these other marketplaces that just existed in a simple text-based, very simple website. We started to organize all the knowledge with Wikipedia and obviously Google and many other efforts that took like from Encarta to Wikipedia to suddenly having all the knowledge that we need just a Google search away. And of course, we started to interact with a lot of businesses. We started to see the first e-commerce companies like Amazon.com really take this connected network as a channel to be able to do any kind of commerce. And because of that, people started to get really excited. You can imagine when everything was changing and the behavior, and suddenly you had all these consumers coming to the web, trying to do something super interesting, that we thought, hey, the world's going to change. It's very obvious. Let's actually bet into that happening. And because of that, well, we really invested a lot. And if you can remember, in 2000, in the dot-com bubble, we over-invested. We thought this was going to come too fast. We tried absolutely every experiment, and most of them sadly failed. And you can see we went from a peak of 5,000 to 20% of that in the stock market. And this is just normal human behavior. We saw with optimism the changes that could come with this technology, and we decided to bet on the fact that humans are able to do those kind of things. But sadly, you know, it was a very dark time after that crash, because we went from being very excited about how computers connected and humans doing all these different interactions could really change all the industries to saying it didn't happen, right? And a lot of people lost their jobs. People who were in Silicon Valley and other places, they recall that time as a moment where the highways went empty, and the parking lots, and rents, and the buildings, and everything. And of course, that brings depression. And people were, of course, doubting if this would ever happen. And that came with all other macroeconomical challenges. And of course, if you see the value of the housing market in the US, right a couple of years after this dot-com crash, we actually had the biggest real estate crisis that ended up being the global financial crisis. And if you go back to that time, everyone was sad, depressed, and thinking that, you know, this was just a gimmick. This was not going to be a permanent change. But somewhere, there were some people who just didn't hear that. And they were like, nope, let's actually take all of this technology and do something interesting with it. And we saw a lot of different examples. These are obviously just two of them. But we saw examples like WordPress being built as an open source community to allow anyone to create a website, and now runs like 40% of the internet is WordPress one way or the other. And also, we saw communities like Twitter get created, and with a lot of optimism, we started to share first very silly stuff like what are we having for breakfast, and later we started to actually, you know, get more serious. And suddenly there were whole revolutions in countries organized on top of Twitter. So you can imagine that all of this came because there were a couple of ingredients that happened in that time that allowed people who were making and builders to really go and create something awesome. The first, I think, very big change that happened at that time, and right during that global financial crisis, was that we suddenly had smartphones. First, the iPhone, very quickly, the Android phone. And that gave us not only these computers connected between each other, but, you know, they just integrated into our lives. They became something that we can be using all day to communicate and obviously exchange any kind of commerce and everything. But then it also came with the App Store, which became a very powerful thing, because right before that, most of what we were doing was through the browser, which at that time was very weak. We could just send HTML images and some basic interactions. But suddenly with the App Store, we could deliver any kind of code to be run in these cell phones. And not only that, it came with a couple of APIs that allowed us to use all the hardware of the mobile phone, but also to monetize and have all the billing information taken care by the App Store. We also had at that time a very interesting movement that was taking all of the compute power that we were using to the cloud. And instead of us having to buy a server, you know, install an operating system, maintaining, keep all the security on that, and that was very expensive when you were starting a company at that time. Now, suddenly, with companies like AWS and Microsoft and many other offering their cloud services, you could buy just exactly the compute power or the networking bandwidth that you need. And the same happened with advertising. When you think about it, with social networks and also search engines adding search ads, suddenly you could actually just spend a couple of bucks to try to find your ideal customer segmented by any kind of information that you want. And all of this led to a situation where you could really create a company faster with less money and impact more people than any other moment before. And that was the next cycle. And personally, I can tell you now from experience, I had the opportunity to experience this directly and went through that whole cycle in a very amazing way. This was me back in a couple of years ago, just taking some silly photos. And I wanted to give you an example of my quick history during 2012 to now, just to give you an idea of that cycle of mobile changing our lives and how it can impact a lot. And it all really started with a chapin. You can see here is Christian from Platzi, and we were back in the day, like 15 years ago, just going through hackathons and traveling through like every place that we could go where there were software developers that were trying to do something new, something different, trying to learn. And first we started with a hackathon called Super Happy Dev House, where we were meeting every 6 weeks for 12 hours to do something fun with code. And then that led us to meet a lot of other interesting people. We started something called the Hackspedition, where we went through inviting people to come first to our homes in Mexico, and then we went to other places like New York and San Francisco, where we had the opportunity to go, for example, to the Maker Faire, a very big conference of people who are just trying to make things with hardware and software and electronics. And of course, you see these kind of crazy displays of people building this in their garages. And of course, it just blows your mind that there's people out there that dedicate their whole lives to try to create something fun like this. And that experience led us to meet a lot of people in these hackathons, like Domix, who then ended up becoming one of the best Java programmers in the region, or Juliana, who also became one of the best LatAm developers that I know in the United States, who had the opportunity to go and visit places like Etsy, like over 10 years ago, and suddenly get a glimpse of how these people were building the companies that we aspire to at someday try to build in Latin America. In those visits, they were open. They would tell us exactly how they were building the companies, and they would even show us their numbers. Like this was a real-time dashboard from Etsy when we visited their offices over 10 years ago. And through these whole interactions, we ended up meeting David Wickley, a really good friend in one of these hackathons, who said like, hey, Santiago, you know what's missing in Latin America? I think you're missing investors. Why don't we create a fund? And with all, without having any idea of how hard it would be to start a fund, we decided to start Mexican VC. We brought a couple of people, and we just tried to raise some capital, and that ended up turning into us meeting 500 Global, which ended up investing in us with other 3 angels. We raised $250,000, which we went to invest in 7 companies. And those 7 companies, one of them ended up being a very important fintech company for the Mexican ecosystem. Since 2013, we joined 500. And we've done a lot of things. We raised 3 funds, one in 2013, one in 2016, one in 2019. We've invested in over 300 companies. We've done 19 batches like this one of companies that have presented. And through this whole process, with a lot of humility and being very humbled, I'm very bold to share with you that we've been able to see some of these companies go from 0 to some of them with more than $100 million in sales per year, with over 1,000 employees that have raised literally billions of dollars, and that I think are going to be the future of the region. And I want to just put a small pin here because I'll come back later to this specific topic. But my main thing trying to share all of this is that I really, having done all of that, wish that I had done more. Because it was super obvious that talent and opportunity was right there in LatAm, and that these factors that I was telling you on how to build companies were going to allow us to do amazing companies in LatAm. So we'll go back to that. But of course, just as we did in 2000, it happened again. We were over-optimistic. We saw everything that was changing, and we rallied to try to invest in that. And we might have, again, just as humans are, been too optimistic. And we saw the funding go up in a moment where the interest rates were low. And suddenly, COVID happened, which was great because that digitalized the customers and made us believe that the change was coming even faster. But when the governments decided to start to try to tame inflation with a bigger interest rate, suddenly investing in risky assets is not as attractive. And because of that, we've seen over a year now of a market recovery where there's less investment in every place in the world for venture capital. And just as it happened in the .com, it's been kind of like a dark time. We've been talking with entrepreneurs who were too optimistic of how fast their companies was going to grow, of where they were going to get, and we've had to do a lot of very painful changes, changing trajectory, making the strategies different, finding the resources enough to try to do what we were trying to do, and sometimes failing at doing that. And again, that comes in a very complicated macroeconomic moment where we have war, we have a lot of political challenges, and of course in Latin America, we've seen a lot of that. And not only that, but this time, we also see an internet that is also troubled. If we think about like the social networks where they are today as a tool for us as users, they really don't look like the kind of solutions that we need. They feel a little bit more like a method for an advertiser or sometimes a government to try to manipulate what we're thinking. But luckily enough, just as last time, there's some people who have been on the other side of this, saying like, hey, technology is cool and humans are good. Why don't we go and build awesome stuff? So when I look at video games, for example, having one of the places where we've been trying to make computers behave a little bit like humans. And we've been trying to do these kind of algorithms that are trying to just create a path finding, like the closest space between 2 points. And suddenly that became a way of saying like, hey, this looks smart. It's behaving like a human would if we wanted to go through that room. Why don't we add a little bit more of technology and more algorithms? And someone went and created these kind of neural networks where you can have data and a little bit of statistics generate some interesting decisions. And it started to become more complicated, just as we saw with the transistor. And ultimately, we built these kind of algorithms, like the transformer, which is the one that is powering all the LLMs that we are now using to create, very interactive applications like Jana, an application made here in Latin America to deal with mental health through interacting with an LLM. We see this generating code. We see this generating images. And suddenly, just as we saw with the introduction of the smartphone, we start to see that the future is going to change. And once again, it's super obvious. That's going to generate a lot of cars that are self-driving. We're starting to see that impact the cost of energy and the way that we're thinking about sustainability. And once again, when you think about all of that, building companies is going to be radically different in the next 5, 10, or 15 years. So what I wanted to do, going back to that pin that I told you, was, if I were to go back when I was starting in 2009, 2010, and try to give me some advice of how to behave when there's so obviously the start of a cycle, I thought of with 3 different advice that I would love to give myself back in 2009, and I think that it applies identically today, that would have allowed me to use that cycle of innovation way better. Because really, I wish I had done more. And we have the obligation now that it's so obvious to go and do even more in the next cycle. The first one is to really detach from the status quo. We know that the future is going to be different. We know LLMs, cost of energy, electrification, all these things that we care about, like sustainability and the environment, are going to make the future in 5 or 10 years be different than today. The fastest that you can get that into your brain and start to change your behavior, the faster you're going to be able to live in that new future and help create it. So usually entrepreneurs are revolutionaries, but it's not that you're revolutionary just for the sake of trying to be different. It's really because you know that the status quo is going to disappear. So use this as an opportunity to really allow yourself to take any risk, do weird things, experiment, but really don't just follow the status quo. The second one is that you have to be close to the people who are actually making stuff. You want to be doing and learning how to use this technology. And this is even more important now because there's a ton of influencers, content creators, brands, startups, and corporations who are trying to build their audience, to try to have more engagement, to try to get you to spend your time and attention. And they're willing to tell you anything in exchange for that time and attention. So really, don't waste your time with blah, blah, blah. Put all of your time into making awesome stuff. And the last one is about how to think about this incredible opportunity where it's obvious that the world's going to change in every aspect. But if you don't have enough depth, then you're not going to be able to use it. So my solution for that is this very simple advice of saying like, hey, do more when you are learning, when you're exploring. But as soon as you find something that inside of you, you're like, yeah, this is something I'm good at. I know the world is going to change in this specific aspect, and I want to be the person who doesn't change that, really go deep. So it's a very simple algorithm. Be generalist until you find something, and then just go as deep as possible so that you can go and change the world. So with that, going back to the very beginning, I was telling you, I'm sure in 5 or 10 years, we're going to look back at this specific Volcano Summit, 2023, and be like, that was the year where everything was happening. And today, we have the opportunity to start using that. So LatAm, it's time to build. This is the day 0 of a new cycle. Thank you very much.